evening, my lords, fellow trustees, predecessors, friends, ladies and gentlemen, very, very warm welcome to, well, it's nice of you to pop into my office. Despite being at the centre of politics, JPR is an apolitical organisation. Our job is to service the Jewish community, to provide other community organisations with empirical evidence to allow them to make effective decisions, and to serve the community by giving an understanding of what's happening in our community on an impartial and unprejudiced basis. And we've been around for a substantial amount of years, over 50 years now, so I think we're getting the hang of it. We are very, very fortunate in having a most distinguished executive director and chairman, and as Jonathan is the person who has all the facts at his fingertips, I'm going to pass over to him. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you to all of you for coming this evening. It's lovely to see so many people here at a real in-person event, and I really appreciate you making the time to come. What we really wanted to do this evening was to share some of the data that I think that I've been pondering and considering, and think is interesting at the moment, as a mechanism of kind of looking at the state of the Jewish community today in 2023. And I want to do that by exploring or touching on three key themes. I hope people can see the screens. I realise they're a little bit small, but I hope I will try to explain what's there if you can't see them. My three key themes this evening are, first of all, viability. What do existing data tell us about the long-term viability of the Jewish community in Britain? Second theme is about vulnerability. What do the data tell us about the extent to which Jews feel threatened by antisemitism in the UK? And my third theme is about vitality. What do the data tell us about the vibrancy and dynamism of the UK Jewish community at the moment? And I want to take each of those in turn, and as I said, just share some of the data that that I think is interesting, and that certainly that I am pondering and considering at the moment. So let me start with viability. And I should say that the very question of the viability of the Jewish community seems like a slightly bizarre thing to ask, because we've been around as a people for about 4,000 years. So you'd think by now we would feel reasonably secure about our long-term future. But I can pretty well guarantee you that in every single generation over the course of those 4,000 years, Jews have asked themselves the question, are we the last generation, one of the last generations of Jews? And you can see why that question is so so important, I think, and so significant to Jews, just by looking at some of the very, very fundamental historical data. These are data on the size of the global Jewish population from the late 19th century up to today. And the key thing you can see is that sort of chasm right in the middle between 1939 and 1945. The shot up, and it shows up so clearly in the demographic data. One of the obvious reasons why that sense of insecurity, that sense of uncertainty about our future is so strong, I think, amongst Jews, and always and has been for a long time, is antisemitism, and we can see it very clearly in recent demographic data. The other key reason can be seen if we look at the equivalent data specifically for the UK. This is the UK Jewish population since the middle of the 19th century up to the end of the 20th century, and you can see it grew and grew and grew up until the 1950s. And then in the second half of the 20th century it declined, and it declined by about a third between the 1950s and 2000. And the former chief rabbi, Lord Sachs, when he first became chief rabbi in the early 1990s, launched his chief rabbinate with a book called Will We Have Jewish Grandchildren?, where the concern was really related to that decline in the Jewish population over the course of the second half of the 20th century. And the concern was not so much about anti-Semitism at that time, but about assimilation, loss of interest, loss of engagement in community, apathy. And those twin factors, the fear or the anxiety about anti-Semitism and the fear and anxiety of assimilation, I think really frame in many respects this question about the long-term viability of the British Jewish community, and indeed of all Jewish communities. But what do the data tell us? So these are data on how many Jews there are in England and Wales from the UK Census in 2001, 2011 and 2021. And what you can see is that in 2001 there were about 259,000, 2011 265,000, 2021 271,000, i.e. the number went up, not dramatically, not massively, but it went up. And given the trend that we saw over the course of the second half of the 20th century, that's an extraordinary turnaround. By the way, those are not the final numbers because the question in the census is a voluntary question. So the orange additions, if you like, on top of those columns are the adjusted figures based on our best assessment of non-response. And the current size of the Jewish population is estimated at least 300,000 now, possibly as high as 310, 315,000 even. There's a lot more work to be done on 2021 census to figure that out. But certainly we can say that the Jewish population of this country is growing. The big question then is, given that we saw that decline over the course of the second half of the 20th century, how did we turn that around? How is it that the Jewish population is now growing? And the answer can be seen in these two charts, these two population pyramids. I don't know whether people are familiar with population pyramids, but very, very quickly, in a nutshell, the bars in orange represent females, the ones in blue represent males, the ones at the bottom represent the youngest age bands, babies and young children, 0 to 4-year-olds, the ones at the top are 85 plus. The higher up you move up the diagrams, the older you get. And essentially, the further the bars extend from the midpoint, the larger that age cohort is in the population as a whole. There are two population pyramids here. The one on the right is for what we call the mainstream Jewish community. The one on the left is for the Haredi community, the strictly Orthodox community. And one of the beautiful things about population pyramids is simply by looking at the shape, you get a sense of what's happening in a population and how likely it is to grow or decline over time. If we look at the one on the right, the mainstream Jewish population, i.e. everyone who is not Haredi, we see a shape which basically suggests that that population is stable, declining very slightly, slowly over time. If you look at the shape on the left, very high proportions of young children, very low proportions of older people, that is a sign of a population that is growing rapidly and dramatically. The Haredi population currently constitutes about 25% of the whole in this country. Everyone else constitutes about 75%. But because of this the demographic dynamics, what's happening is that the Haredi population is becoming, over time, a larger and larger part of the whole. And it is now large enough to have affected that decline that we saw over the course of the second half of the 20th century to enable the population as a whole to grow. But there is a really important compositional change going on in the Jewish population at the moment, where the Haredi population is becoming a larger and larger part of the whole. Those are some initial thoughts about viability. Let me move on to, I should say this lastly. These are also data from the census from 2001, 2011, 2021, and this is some contextual data which I think is important as well. What you can see here is the proportion of people in Britain who self-identified as Christian, the three columns on the left, and the proportion of people who self-identified as having no religion, the three columns on the right. And what you can see is that 20 years ago, about 72% of all people in this country identified as Christian. In the last census, 2021, just 20 years later, that proportion had dropped to 46%. On the right-hand column, those people who self-identify as having no religion, that proportion climbed from about 15% to 37% over the course of the same period. The religious nature of Britain is changing dramatically. It is becoming less and less Christian and more secular. And one of the dynamics I think that Jewish community leaders really need to grapple with in the years to come is that we can see from the demographic data on Jews that the Jewish population is becoming increasingly religious because of the demographic changes that are going on here. But in the broader context of Britain, British society is becoming increasingly secular. And the scope for misunderstandings, disagreements, tensions, because of that distinction, I think is reasonably self-evident. and something that we need to be very conscious of looking ahead. Moving on to the second theme, vulnerability. And really the question here is about anti-Semitism and how anti-Semitism is impacting the Jewish community and exactly what's going on. These are community security trust data. I want to recognise Mike Wine, who's really kind of the mastermind behind setting up these data in the first place. But these are anti-Semitic incident counts gathered by the CST, reported to the CST from January 2000 all the way up to December 2022. There's a lot to say about these data, but the key thing I really want to focus on are those very, very dramatic spikes you can see. One in January 2009, one in summer 2014, and one in May 2021. All of which coincide directly with the outbreak of major moments of conflict between Israel and the Palestinians in Gaza. We can see very clearly from these data that when the situation deteriorates in Israel, when conflict breaks out in Israel, it spills over onto the streets of Britain, and Jews are directly impacted by that very, very clearly. Just after the most recent episode in May 2021, that last spike, we ran a survey of Jews in Britain where we asked them a few questions about that whole episode and how they felt about it. And what we found is we asked them if they agree or disagree with this statement. Because I'm Jewish, I felt I was being held responsible by non-Jews for the actions of Israel's government. Close to 75% of people said they agreed to some degree with that statement. And the second statement, public and media criticism of Israel during the conflict made me feel as if Jews are not welcome in the UK. On that statement, we had about 56% agreement. These are two very different types of data, gathered in very different ways, but we can see very clearly that there is a direct relationship between what happens in Israel, particularly during those periods of conflict, and how Jews feel and what Jews experience on the streets of the UK. That dynamic is clear and apparent. A few comments about major patterns in anti-Semitism. So these are proportions of Jews of different age bands in 2021 and 2022 who reported experiencing anti-Semitic abuse online directed at them personally. I don't want to dwell too much on the figures, but I do want to dwell on the age dynamic here, because I don't know if you can see the chart from the back, but essentially the column on the left is the youngest people, and as we move further to the right, we get older and older and older. So you can see very clearly that there's a relationship between online anti-Semitic abuse and age. The younger you are, the more likely you are to experience it. This chart gives an interesting denominational picture. This is data in 2021 and 2022 on have you experienced at least one type of anti-Semitism over the course of the 2 years shown, 2021, 2022, by broad denominational grouping. So you could self-identify as strictly Orthodox, as Central Orthodox, or Modern Orthodox if you like, as Progressive, Reform, Liberal, and as none, not associating with any of those, largely being unaffiliated. One of the interesting things, by the way, experiencing one incident of anti-Semitism, or at least one type of anti-Semitism, the types there are either harassment, including online, or discrimination, or vandalism, or violence. In most cases, we're talking here about harassment. Cases of violence are very rare. But there is a very, very interesting denominational relationship with anti-Semitism. Jews who are strictly Orthodox, i.e. are very clearly identifiably Jewish, are much, much more likely to report having experienced an anti-Semitic incident than Jews who are not Central Orthodox or progressive Jews. But interestingly, at the other end of the denominational spectrum, the nuns, and that's N-O-N-Es, not the N-U-Ns, just to be clear. There aren't many nuns in the Jewish community. But the nuns also report experiencing, or large proportions of them report experiencing high levels of anti-Semitism. And there, what we know about that group is that they are much more likely to live outside of Jewish neighbourhoods, much more likely to be isolated. So in a lot of cases, these are people who are the only Jew in their workplace, or the only Jew in their school, or the only Jew in their class. And what we see among them is also a much more common experience of anti-Semitism than is the case amongst the sort of the Central Orthodox and the progressive. So kind of at both ends of the denominational spectrum, we can see high levels of experience of anti-Semitism, which is just, I think, a kind of an interesting observation. All of that said, I don't want to overstate anti-Semitism, and it's important not to. These are data going back to 1995 all the way to 2022 of the numbers of Jews from Britain who have made Aliyah, who have migrated to Israel each year. And this is the number per 1,000 in the population. And what you can see is that that line basically remains very, very flat over that period. You know, there are small fluctuations up and down, but basically it's flat. It's about 2 in every 1,000 every year. We know that people make Aliyah, migrate to Israel for all sorts of reasons, out of a sense of Zionist fervour, sometimes for economic reasons, sometimes for love. But one of the factors that drives migration to Israel is anti-Semitism, or a sense of insecurity. And what we can see in terms of the British figures is stability. When we look at 2 other fairly large European Jewish communities, Germany and Hungary, we see a very, very similar pattern, pretty stable figures. But when we look at France, this is what the picture looks like. The figures are actually quite similar in the late 1990s, but then we see them grow, and we see a dramatic spike in 2013, 14, 15, 16, which is of course directly related to the security situation there at the time, a series of murderous terrorist attacks on Jewish targets, the Jewish school in Toulouse, people will remember the attack on the kosher supermarket in Paris, and French Jews responded in this way. One of the underlying fears of the British Jewish community is that if we were to experience a similar type of event here, that it would have a similar kind of impact in terms of British Jews leaving the country. But as things stand, the situation is actually remarkably stable. Another thing to bear in mind, and this perhaps both reinforces the point that things are perhaps not as bad here as elsewhere, is this is the proportion of Jews in various different countries across Europe who say that they are either very or fairly worried about experiencing anti-Semitism. In blue, about experiencing verbal anti-Semitism or harassment, and in orange, about experiencing some kind of physical attack. And certainly compared to other countries in Europe, particularly France, Germany, Belgium, the UK scores much, much lower. At the same time, we can't avoid the fact that 20% of British Jews say that they are either very or fairly worried about experiencing an anti-Semitic physical attack. That's 1 in 5 living with that sort of sense of anxiety or concern or fear, which is even though comparatively to other countries is low, it still strikes me as a rather high figure. Let me move on to my third theme, vitality. And here the question really is, how strong is our Jewish identity today, and what comprises it, and what are some of the challenges, I think, that face us in terms of our identity? We ask a question in our surveys for people to tell us, on a scale of 1 to 10, how strong would you say your Jewish identity is, with 1 being low and 10 being high? This is research that we've done across Europe. We've asked this question of lots of different Jewish populations. And typically the scores are in the sort of the 7s to 8s in most countries, and the UK is very much in that ballpark. It's the 5th on this list, but it's around the 8 mark. So on a scale of 1 to 10, that's a pretty high score. On average, of course, some Jews score higher than that, some score lower, but that's the average score. So on the basis of that alone, you would say that Jewish identity here is pretty strong, and that Jewishness really matters in all sorts of ways to most Jews. The question I think that follows, though, is what is it that comprises that Jewish identity? Because Jewish identity can be expressed in all sorts of different ways. It can be expressed through celebrating Jewish festivals with your family, or it can be feeling part of the Jewish people, or giving to charity, or religious aspects, belief in God, prayer. It can be about Jewish cultural life. It can be about combating anti-Semitism. It can be about a sense of remembering the Holocaust. There are a variety of different ways that one could express or think about their Jewish identity. One of the things that we see in these data, and this is in blue for the UK and in orange for Europe as a whole, is that the features that come out most high on this measure are remembering the Holocaust and combating anti-Semitism. And in fact, whichever country we look at, whichever denomination we look at, whichever age band we look at, whichever gender we look at, we find this time and time again. The things that people say are most important about their Jewish identity over and over again are combating anti-Semitism and remembering the Holocaust. Now, that gives, I think, a sense of the concern that I was speaking about before. But I think what troubles me about that is that I don't think that combating anti-Semitism or remembering the Holocaust is really any sort of basis upon which to build a strong and vibrant Jewish identity. Jewish identity should be built ideally on the basis of religiosity or tradition or heritage or culture or ideas or values, but not really on a sense of fear, historical or contemporary, of what might happen to us. And yet it is, time and time again, the feature that dominates in terms of what people see as most important to their Jewish identity. I think it's an important issue for community leaders to grapple with today and in the years to come. This is another feature, looking at Jewish identity in a little bit more detail. I'm really struck by this. I wrote about it in the JC a couple of weeks ago. What you can see here is 3 bars. The top one is people who said their upbringing was Orthodox. They described their upbringing as Orthodox. The middle bar is people who describe their upbringing as traditional, i.e. somewhat less than Orthodox, if you like. And the bottom bar is people who describe their upbringing as reform or progressive. And so we're looking at people who describe their upbringing in that way, and we're asking them the question, when you think about your current position, would you say you have become more traditionally observant, less traditionally observant over the course of your life, or stayed pretty well in the same position? The first thing that strikes me is the figures for each of those 3 groups are almost identical. About 60% have stayed where they are, about 30% in each case have become less traditionally observant, about 10% have become more so. That shift I mentioned earlier about the growth of secularism in this country, I think affects all of us. There is more of a pull, if you like, to less traditional observance, more of a pull towards secularism for all Jews, irrespective of who they are denominationally, than in the other direction. And again, one of the questions I think when we think about Jewish identity is, as we are pulled more and more in a secular direction, how do we maintain a strong and robust Jewish identity? I need to talk about Israel. I thought about whether I should or shouldn't, but I will talk about Israel because of what's going on at the moment, and it's an important part of Jewish identity. By the way, in the chart I showed before about the aspects of Jewish identity that are most important, what we see is that supporting Israel has, for at least 10, 15 years or so now, typically sat in the middle of that range. Anti-Semitism, Holocaust, family are all considered more important. Aspects of religiosity, God, prayer, etc., less important. Supporting Israel typically sits around in the middle of that scale. It has, while we don't have data going back to the 70s, 60s, 70s on this, I'm almost certain that the position of supporting Israel as a key feature of Jewish identity has dropped over time. But a few pieces of data that I think are significant in the current context. The first is this: how attached do Jews feel to Israel? And this is a comparison between Jews in the UK and Jews in America, a couple of years apart, but broadly speaking comparable. British Jews feel considerably more attached to Israel than American Jews. There is a noticeable difference, and I think one of the reasons for that is the geographical proximity. We are much, much more likely to have visited. We're much, much more likely to have personal connections, to have friends and family living there. So I think the connection that British Jews tend to feel with Israel is more real, more grounded than American Jews who are that bit more distant. The second thing I want to show you is this, and it relates to the data I was just talking about. To what extent is supporting Israel an important part of your Jewish identity? These are data that were gathered in Britain 10 years apart. The bottom bar is for 2013, the top one is for the end of 2022. How important is supporting Israel to your Jewish identity? What strikes me is there has literally been no change. It is uncanny how similar the figures are and how they are distributed. It seems to me that British Jews remain grounded and attached to Israel, that there hasn't really been a significant shift in our fundamental support for Israel certainly over the course of the last 10 to 15 years. But politically, there's some interesting stuff going on, and we've actually just released a report about this week. But these are other data that come from the survey that we ran at the very end of last year, and they ask about whether British Jews approve or disapprove of key Israeli political figures. Benjamin Netanyahu, the current Prime Minister, Tzalel Smotrich, the current Finance Minister, and Yair Lapid, the former Prime Minister. And what you can see here is this is discounting people who don't know, and there are different proportions of people who don't have an opinion either way on these characters, probably because they don't know who they are. But the proportion of people, once you remove the don't knows, who disapprove either strongly or somewhat of Netanyahu at the moment is around 70%. Of Smotrich, it's around 80%. Of Lapid, it's around 33%. So if I had to characterise the British-Jewish relationship with Israel at the moment, I would say that the attachments and the connections remain pretty strong and deep. But there is pretty widespread concern, I think, about the current government and some of the policies it is pursuing, and certainly about some of the characters that are involved in it. All of that said, and I am coming to the end, when we ask Jews in different European countries how they identify today, do they identify as Reform Progressive, as traditional, as Haredi, as just Jewish, i.e. don't really associate with any of those labels, or as mixed, or none, what you can see is these kind of a very, very multifaceted picture pretty well everywhere. There is no uniform Jewish identity in any of the countries of Europe, certainly, that we look at. We are diverse. We express our Jewishness in lots of different ways. And to my mind, in many respects, that's a strength, because it allows Jews to find their own place in the community and express their Jewishness in the ways that they wish. But the question I think it poses for us going forward is, what is it that will unify us? What is it that we have in common with one another? At the moment, the feature that we seem to have in common more than anything else, as I've said, is this concern about anti-Semitism. I worry about that because I don't think it's a strong enough or robust enough basis upon which to build Jewish identity. I think Jewish identity is strong fundamentally, but it's very much affected by anti-Semitism. There's a strong pull towards secularism that affects us and is significant. And I think there are growing questions about unity and what it is that holds us together. In terms of our programme over the course of the next couple of years, we're focused on all of these three themes. In terms of viability, the work that we're doing is we're doing a lot of ongoing work on the 2021 census. Those data are being released gradually, and we're doing work on that on an ongoing basis. And we also run our own European Jewish Demography Unit, which is generating data for Jews across Europe. We recently published a report on Belgium. We've got another report coming out on Jews in Spain. We're in conversation with a major foundation about doing work in Bulgaria and Helsinki. So there's a lot of work happening across Europe as well. In terms of vulnerability, we have two big surveys that we are working on at the moment. One is about Jewish people's perceptions and experiences of anti-Semitism. There is a major survey being conducted by the European Union at the moment. It's the third in a series. We actually ran it for them in the first two rounds of that survey in 2012 and 2018, but of course now that the UK is no longer part of the European Union, it's not included. But we're running essentially a version of that survey here in order to ensure that we continue to track Jewish people's perceptions and experiences of anti-Semitism and have comparative data with Europe. The second study that we're working on in terms of anti-Semitism in Europe is a study of non-Jews' attitudes towards Jews and Israel. We conducted a big study of that about 5 years ago with support from the CST and the government. and we are working on doing effectively the same study again now, in order to see if the attitudes have shifted and how they've shifted in Britain. And in terms of vitality, we ran a National Jewish Identity Survey at the end of last year. It's the first time in 10 years that we've run that survey, and we will be publishing the results of that later this year. We are looking at the kind of how Jewish identity has or has not changed over the course of the last 10 years, which of course includes the pandemic period and includes the Corbyn years and that whole experience. And we'll be looking closely at how Jews have or have not changed in terms of their understanding of Jewish identity. And the other thing that we're working hard on is we have built over the last few years a UK Jewish population research panel. It's a unique project in the Jewish world, and it's designed effectively to enable us to gather data on British Jewish attitudes and behaviours and beliefs in a more efficient, rapid and effective manner. Grateful to a number of people in the room who are supporting that work, not least Ashley and Sally, who have been important donors to that work. So these three themes are very much kind of at the heart of our work over the course of the next few years, and there are a number of different projects that we are currently working on, raising funds for, and looking to develop. I'm going to end at that point. I'll just see how we're doing for time. Happy to take questions for 10 minutes or so, or any responses or thoughts about anything I've said. But those are really just a few thoughts, indicators, data points that strike me as important at this point in terms of British Jewish life.